Democracy Frontline Center. What is that? What kind of news is that? Is it for Georgia, for region, or?
So this is an idea of Nino Gelashvili, who runs the Economic Policy Research Center. And she has asked me to be a part of this along with Frank Fukuyama at Stanford University. And the idea is to provide a hub here in Tbilisi for the region. It's a region where... Which includes Georgia, of course, but it includes the whole South Caucasus, but it also would include people from Russia, from Ukraine, from Belarus, Moldova. And the idea is to provide a hub, a center for democracy activists and human rights advocates, for journalists and others who want to focus on how to advance the cause of democracy, who maybe are coming under attack and need a place to get away from the pressure situations. And it is to also provide important analysis, up-to-date information, to learn lessons from each other on what works best in trying to advance the cause of democracy and freedom. And Georgia, I think, is a perfect place to have this. It's sort
Why
of an island.
Why do you think so?
It's an island of democracy amid a sea of authoritarian regimes, frankly. And while Armenia is showing some hope and progress after the revolution last year, if you look at other countries in the region, it really is an authoritarian wave that is trying to undermine democracy elsewhere, including in this country. And so there is a need for people who are fighting for democracy, fighting for respect for human rights, to have a place to go, to learn lessons, to share experiences, to sometimes just get away from a situation that they need to. And it also is designed to help journalists and lawyers and other people. And so it's a great initiative, and I'm very proud to be a part of it, and I'm grateful to Nino for having the idea.
Why should Ukrainian activists, politicians or journalists should come to Georgia to discuss something? What do you think?
I've felt for a number of years, but particularly since 2014, after Russia invaded Ukraine, that Ukraine and Georgia should be doing much more together, because even though Ukraine is maybe 10 times the size of Georgia, they share the experience of having been invaded, their sovereignty and territorial integrity invaded. And the whole idea is that Russia under Putin is trying to undermine the push for democracy here in Georgia and the push for democracy in Ukraine. Putin doesn't want to see Georgians or Ukrainians demand better from their government. He doesn't want to see Georgia or Ukraine become thriving democracies that offer alternative models to the system Putin has in place inside Russia. And so Ukrainians should come here, Georgians should go there, but with this center it provides a home for Ukrainians and others to come, share their experiences, demonstrate what has worked in their country, what is not working, so that Georgians and others, Azerbaijanis, Armenians, Moldovans, can all learn from this experience. So there is a common cause here. There is a common root, which is the struggle for democracy in these countries that are constantly transitioning from the devastating legacy of the Soviet period, which I think these countries have not fully overcome, combined with an effort by the Putin regime to undermine the accomplishments here in Georgia as well as in Ukraine. I was in Ukraine recently, and I'm
glad you continue with Ukraine. My next question was about
exactly.
Ukraine.
So I was there for the second round of the election as an observer with the International Republican Institute, and I was there just 10 days ago. And I think there is a sense of hope with the election of Zelensky. Not everyone voted for him, but 73% of those who turned out to vote did vote for him. So he clearly has a mandate. It was also an anti-establishment vote, but Zelensky is going to be tested by Putin. He's going to be tested on the economic front. Ukrainians want to see economic improvement according to the World Bank standards, Ukraine is actually now the poorest country in Europe, replacing Moldova.
They want to see corruption fought?
They absolutely want to see corruption fought. That is one of the top issues. And President Poroshenko, I think, made a lot of progress in Ukraine in the 5 years that he was in the leadership. But on the issue of corruption, there's a sense that he didn't do anywhere near enough. And I think that's a main reason why he lost the election by a huge landslide. To his credit, Poroshenko's credit, he acknowledged the results, he conceded defeat, he graciously handed over power to Zelensky, and now Zelensky has called for early parliamentary or Rada elections, and so Ukraine is likely to undergo by July 21 another round of elections, this time for parliament.
You said there is much hope in Ukraine after elections, and many people, I've heard from many people I read also, liked Zelensky's speech, inauguration.
His inaugural speech, absolutely.
But do you feel optimistic? And you mentioned testing time. How much time could be considered as a testing?
I agree with you that his inaugural speech was very good. He hit all the right notes. It had some elements of populism combined with an understanding of the responsibilities of leadership. His response to President Putin's passportization efforts, which Georgia has experienced as well, I think was exactly right. And so he has responded to challenges that have come his way in a very good way. I think there is a sense of hope there in Ukraine, and I think the international community has a responsibility to work with him, to embrace him, to help support him, to help him succeed. It is in Ukraine's interest that Zelensky succeeds. It's in Georgia's interest that Zelensky succeeds. It's in the United States' interest that Zelensky succeeds. And eventually, one day, it'll be in Russia's interest that Zelensky succeeds.
What could Georgia and Ukraine do against Russian politics together?
So these two countries, Ukraine and Georgia, one, have experienced Russian aggression and Russian invasion. Two, they are the constant targets of Russian disinformation, where Russia tries to create doubts in Georgians' minds and Ukrainians' minds about what the real situation is. They have been the targets of cyber attacks from the Kremlin, and they have, I think, demonstrated, the people in both countries have demonstrated a strong desire to live in a freer society that is more integrated with the Euro-Atlantic community, that is free of Russia's heavy hand. Unless there's a massive earthquake, which no one hopes for, Georgia and Russia will always border each other. But Georgia also wants stronger, deeper ties with the European Union, with NATO. Recent polls have shown that even though I think Georgians are frustrated with the lack of progress toward NATO, despite a pledge 11 years ago that Georgia and Ukraine would become members of NATO, there's still strong support. I think it was 78% I saw in a recent poll for joining NATO.
But yes,
it is dropping,
Yeah.
and this is a concern that I have. And this is as much on the part of NATO as it is on the part of Georgia's leaders. There has not been enough progress shown since the Bucharest communique in 2008, in which NATO said Georgia and Ukraine would become members. There has not been enough progress for Georgians to understand that they are moving in the right direction. I think there is concern among some Georgians, there's concern among some Ukrainians, that they will never reach the goal of NATO membership. And so I think NATO has to reassure Georgia and Ukraine of the pledge made 11 years ago. Secretary General Stoltenberg was here not that long ago, reaffirmed this message.
Yes.
And so I think we need to move from rhetoric to real action.
What could be before membership, in between?
I'm not sure
what
a membership.
What could be the important decision from the NATO?
So in 2008, as you recall, the aspiration for Georgia then was a membership action plan.
Yep.
And NATO did not provide that. Instead, it made this pledge. In a way, it was a pledge that went further than a membership action plan. But I think for Georgia, I'm not sure seeking a membership action plan would be a step forward. It might even be a step backward. It might not be a step really in any direction at all. Georgia needs to continue to stay on a path for achieving NATO membership. It has demonstrated its readiness to contribute to NATO missions. In Afghanistan, at one point, it had been the second largest contributor.
Yeah.
And Georgia has faced Russian forces in 2008. It is making real progress in civilian control and in training. And so I think Georgia has demonstrated that it is moving in the right direction. NATO needs to demonstrate that it is ready to accept Georgia. It's not going to be tomorrow. It probably won't be this year or next year, but before too long. Otherwise, NATO grants Russia a de facto veto over Georgia's aspirations to join, over Ukraine's aspirations. If NATO says a country can't join because part of its territory is occupied, that will actually provide further incentive for Russia to occupy another country's territory if it knows that by doing so it will wind up leading to that country never joining. So we have to show that occupation, which is an egregious violation of another country's sovereignty and territorial integrity, does not disqualify a country from joining. Let's remember, West Germany became part of NATO even though East Germany was essentially occupied by the Soviet Union. And so very different time, but the need for security that is provided by Article 5 guarantees under NATO's charter remains the same. And if we have seen Russian readiness under Putin's leadership to use force to invade his neighbors, and that argues even more for membership. You look at the Baltic states are still somewhat nervous, but they sleep better at night knowing that they are NATO members with Article 5 security guarantees. In my view, Georgia and Ukraine should be entitled to the same protection.
Before NATO membership of these two countries, what do you think should be the next step? For instance, I remember Poroshenko's initiative, but it didn't develop, as far as I know, to broaden sanctions against Russia by the West, which are for the invasion in Ukraine, to add to that Georgia's occupation also. But it didn't develop, didn't go ahead, as far as I know. In this kind of term, what could these two countries do together with the help of the West?
Well, there has, I think, been insufficient coordination between Georgia and Ukraine on sanctions.
But was it enough coordination between these two countries only?
I don't think
because
it has.
There was no incentive from the West also, I guess.
There wasn't, but I do think that Georgia and Ukraine and the leaders in both countries should recognize they have much more in common than they have that differentiates them. They are countries struggling to break free from Putin's effort to pull them back under Russian control. They are countries that have experienced bloodshed as a result of Russian aggression. And they are countries that should be striving to achieve the same thing, which is a more democratic society, a more prosperous society, and a country that is more integrated into the Euro-Atlantic community. With those shared goals and objectives, Georgia and Ukraine should be doing much more together. And so I hope with the change in leadership in Kiev, that the Georgian leadership will recognize the need to reach out to their Ukrainian counterparts.
Mr. Kramer, are Western sanctions effective against Russia?
Western sanctions are effective if they are increased over a period of time. If Western sanctions simply remain at the level that they're at, the Russians can adjust to them. The Russian economy, the Russian leadership can adjust to them. In order for sanctions to work, and I actually think they have had an impact. I think they kept Putin from going further into Ukraine in 2014 and 15. But in order for them to try to change Putin's behavior, you have to keep increasing sanctions until you see that change in behavior. And once you see the change in behavior, if Russia were to withdraw not only from Donbass but from Crimea, then I think the sanctions could be lifted. But now is certainly not the time to lift sanctions.
Let's go back to Georgia. I don't know if this interview can be endless, but I'm not sure if we'll meet before the next elections. Actually, the recent elections are not finished yet also. Right. And we are heading to the second round in one of the districts in Tbilisi. But all this is seen, and it's obvious that everybody thinks about the next parliamentary elections of 2020. And I would like to ask you, what do you think is the main thing that Georgia should avoid, the main risk Georgia should avoid in the context of 2020 elections?
So I would say that there are a few things. One is avoid the polarization that we see in other countries, including, by the way, in my country, the United States, where the polarization between Democrats and Republicans is higher than I've seen in many, many years. It is important for a country, particularly one that is facing pressure and intimidation and aggression from Russia, to work together even with their political differences. But the second thing is, it's important to recognize that grabbing power and keeping the opposition from returning to power should not be your objective. You should seek to win elections in order to advance the overall cause for Georgia, which is more political reform, more economic reform, security reform, and deeper integration with the Euro-Atlantic community. I do worry that in Georgia there has been a tendency to win elections for the sake of winning elections without having a clear platform on what the winning party wants to do with that victory. And so I think there needs to be a stronger case made for what Georgian Dream in this particular case would do if it were to win parliamentary elections, or for the opposition to lay out what it would do if it were to win elections. And hopefully there would be more common ground than might at least initially appear to be the case, where these parties would agree on more democratic reform, more economic reform, more security reform, and deeper integration with the Euro-Atlantic community. So I hope that there could be some common agreement while recognizing that there are political differences that come to the surface through elections. Indeed.
Thank you so much.
A pleasure. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.